I think 2020 was the moment that I was locked into my home in Sydney, Australia, and I was thinking, my work is remote, it's online. Why don't I just leave instead of paying all these taxes to these people who don't care about me, don't care about the way I think, don't care about my freedoms? I might as well leave. But when I saw Bitcoin, I saw actually there's a real possibility to actually make the world freer. So I took a lot of hope in that, and that was something that to me was, okay, yes, we're not going to be able to get to liberty by voting for it, but we can actually enhance and push for liberty by adopting Bitcoin.
From Nomad Capitalist Live 2023 in Kuala Lumpur, where we've got every room in the house. I'm joined by Stephan Livera. He is a podcaster talking about Bitcoin, libertarianism, Austrian economics, and he's got a very unique perspective about getting away from your home country bias. So Stephan, good to have you here.
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me. I've had a great time at the event so far. A lot of interesting people that you've managed to pull together.
One of the topics that I think a lot of people have been discussing here over this week is there going to be another lockdown? Is the government going to do something else? Tell me first, what are your thoughts? Having moved from Australia to Dubai, you were in the thick of it during COVID. Are they going to do it again?
It sounds like they're going to try, which is unfortunate, right? Most people are probably watching this thinking, no, not again. We don't want to do this
It'll never happen. It was the last and only time.
Yeah, right. It's just like in politics, as I'm sure, you're kind of not interested in politics, but at the same time, it forces itself on you. And every cycle, this is the most important election. It's the same kind of...
The most important election of our lifetimes, this one, right?
So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think they will try. I think they're already trying in various ways. There's different things, right? Whether it's the COVID stuff, whether it's the climate stuff, whether it's the ultra low emissions, whatever stuff that you're hearing about in the UK. I think they will try. But I believe this time there's more people who are going to push back. And I think you just need that crucial 10 to 20% of the population who are willing to stand up or at least say something about it. But nevertheless, there's, some parts of the world are on a bad trend. I think we can agree on that. But I think it will be also a story of different countries and different jurisdictions. Some of them are trying to be competitive and others are not. Right.
And where you moved to Dubai, certainly they wanted to be competitive to a large extent during the pandemic. Many others did. To me, COVID is just a stand-in. The lockdowns are just a stand-in. Are they going to do something else that takes away from your freedom? And Jim Rogers yesterday talked about which countries are going up, which countries are going down. I think your family at some point immigrated to Australia from Sri Lanka.
Correct.
Which countries do you think are going up right now and which are going down?
So obviously I'm in the UAE, so I'm obviously bullish on the UAE. I think parts of Asia, obviously as a Bitcoiner, I'm bullish on El Salvador just because of what they're doing with Bitcoin as native legal tender. And if you just look at the sheer improvement in terms of the crime statistics, that literally a few years ago, El Salvador was the murder capital of the world, and now they stopped the gangs, and now it's actually safe. I think there are different parts of the world that are actually trying to be competitive, like we were saying. And so, yeah, I think the UAE, I actually think Saudi Arabia is actually, they're looking to try to copy the success of Dubai. And so there may be opportunities there for people who want to, if they were to put out a program like a free zone program or some kind of program like this, there may be opportunities in that vein of sort of an up-and-coming place that is trying to improve their reputation and improve their overall standing. So I think those are a couple examples, but I think I probably remain mostly bullish on the UAE. I think they are trying to double their population. I can't remember the stat, but maybe by 2040, and they're about maybe 3.5 million today in Dubai. UAE is about 10 million. So I think they're looking to double Dubai in 20 years. So they're definitely trying to grow.
I'm glad you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Zubi's here talking about that. He grew up in Saudi Arabia. He said it's more open now, but he had a great time growing up there and didn't think it matched what's put into the media. You mentioned lower crime in El Salvador. I would imagine some people watching this, to your point on home country bias, there's certain authoritarianism in their country. They ignored that while saying, oh, well, that guy in El Salvador is probably being an authoritarian in order to get that crime down. In order for Saudi Arabia, yeah, it's safe, but they're no good. talk about the home country bias, where people where you live are fantastic, and when they do the same thing somewhere else, it's terrible.
Absolutely, Andrew. This is a fantastic point to get onto, because people are very happy to point to the human rights failings of other countries while completely ignoring the failures of their own, right? So I'll get Americans who say, oh, why are you, bullish on these other countries, with zero self-awareness about what the US government has done.
It's been as many wars as years I've been alive, essentially.
Right, we have lived through an era of forever wars. Now, famously, Iraq and Afghanistan, of basically 20-year wars that the US has waged. The massive surveillance that the US government in particular has done, whether it's the NSA, the FBI, whether it's financial regulations like FATCA and CRS, there are all kinds of things that are sort of going wrong with the world if you were to really look objectively at what's happening. I think fundamentally 2020 changed a lot of things for me, because I was already a libertarian, right? I was already a libertarian from about 16, 17, kind of 15, 16, yeah. And so I was living in Australia, but I was at that point where I would, like most people, you kind of recruit for whatever you do, right? So I would say, oh, hey, Australia's great. You should come and, come to Australia. But that changed in 2020 for me. Even as because up until then I would have thought, oh, yeah, it's high tax, but you know what? We're freer than those.
Did you see it coming?
In terms of
anything? I mean, so you acknowledged there was crazy high tax, but you kind of said, you kind of excused it away.
But I was concerned. I would say in the 2010s, we started to see a little bit more of the typical, what is now called wokeism, but we're starting to see a little bit of more socialist ideas and socialist kind of thinking that had really taken hold from, I would say, the 2010s onwards. So I was a little more concerned at that point, but I was still sort of like, well, we're still more developed and we're more free than those other countries, right? Now, as any Australian, Canadian, or New Zealander can tell you, we thought we were better than the rest of the world. We thought we were freer than the rest of the world, but we weren't. So I think that it just shows you. And so you get people making this point of, oh, what about freedom of speech? What use was freedom of speech to me when I was locked down in Australia?
Did you have that? You didn't have freedom of speech. They came to your door. Didn't the police come to your door? And was it the UK or Australia?
Yeah, so not me
over
personally,
Facebook
but
posts?
that was
Not your
people,
correct,
yeah.
but they would come to people's doors.
Exactly, and so people might be familiar. There was a famous video in Melbourne area. This poor lady, she was a pregnant lady. She was organizing basically like an anti-lockdown protest, and it wasn't even in the highest lockdown zone area of Melbourne. She was in an area further away. She was a pregnant lady about to go to her ultrasound, and literally the police barge in and they arrest her and they take her in, and she's a pregnant lady about to go for the ultrasound in like an hour. It was like just mind-blowing that this kind of thing would happen. Or even because some 12-year-old girl walking on the street in Melbourne was not wearing the mask, or maybe was slipping down a little bit, and then this policeman, this big police guy, is like ramming her into the ground. And this is the free Australia. This is what we're meant to laud as some great human rights example.
And I'm sure, listen, I'm a pragmatist to some extent. I'm sure there are people who took it too far in both directions. I obviously am on the side of freedom. But even if you say, hey, listen, just wear a mask, you should at least stand up for people's right to disagree and to peacefully say that. And it seems to me that perhaps because, as my mother would say, pride cometh before the fall, you think you're so free, that's what causes you to descend into where a lot of people welcome authoritarianism in whatever form it may be that day.
I think it's complacency. I think it's fear. Fear is the mind killer. It's a famous saying or something. But basically, because people were so scared, they would scream at their politicians, lock us down harder. That was what most people were saying. Now, there was a very small group of us who were saying, no, lockdowns are wrong. But unfortunately, there weren't enough people saying, hey, lockdowns are wrong. Anyway,
take it beyond lockdowns to anything that impacts freedom. I saw a statistic, and I've mentioned this before, something like 30% of Gen Z North Americans say put security cameras inside the house because it's better that people can hack into me showering and watch that, just in case maybe somebody might be the victim of domestic violence. Obviously, we're not in favor of domestic violence, but the idea that everybody is going to be on camera all the time in your own home, 30% of people, that to me is the kind of thing where it doesn't matter what the issue is.
Yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, it's not just lockdowns. Lockdowns was just one example, as you said. It's this kind of creeping culture of safetyism and sort of praising virtue signaling over actual competence. And we're seeing a bit of a competence crisis. And we're seeing instances where, because of the various forms of welfare statism that is going on in the Western world, there are places who can't even get employees. They're trying to hire, but they cannot, and they can't even pay enough to attract somebody because of, it could be welfare statism, whether it's stimmy checks or something else, or just people there's a lot of people who are just kind of mentally checking out, which is unfortunate. So I think, as you said, being a pragmatist, you have to sort of go to places where they're not just checking out and they're actually still mentally there, and they're still in the game, and they're trying to produce things of value. Definitely. But I think broadly, this idea of safetyism, this kind of, your rights don't matter, we'll keep you safe kind of thing.
Do they even really, you look at a lot of places, maybe in California, not so far where I lived in the United States. If your car's broken into, if your shop's robbed, now they're just doing brazen robberies, 20 people in ski masks in broad daylight. Any of that stuff, don't even call the police. Yeah. Just go and file a form online. They're happy to fly their drone over your Labor Day picnic and make sure you're not up to no good. But they're even keeping you safe.
Yeah, that's definitely a point. And so what I am hearing as well in some of these instances is people are literally not even phoning it in. So it looks like the crime stats are lower than they really are in some of these cases.
And then they go and say that's why we're so much better, because our crime stats are lower than somewhere else, even though you've seen, look at Latin America, for example. Most countries in Latin America have seen a steady 2-decade-long decline in violent crime. But what people will say, and they said this during COVID too, by the way, do you think that country's really reporting the real numbers? And again, there's the bias,
exactly.
as if everything where you live, why? Because you're there, you're keeping an eye on things?
Yeah, and I think another point that, it's funny because with safety and the conversation in the Middle East, as you saw recently with the Qatar World Cup, there was a lot of people complaining about, Qatar, human rights, etc. But at the same time, there were all these people who went to Qatar and saw, hey, it's actually really safe here. And I was looking at, in terms of literally by the numbers, right, taking away our home country bias, what are some of the safe countries in the world? It's literally Qatar, UAE, are some of the safest in the world.
Singapore, maybe a couple in Eastern Europe, not a little bit lower down the ranks, but yes.
So,
it's
exactly.
East Asian and the Gulf.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of, times can change, and people can be operating in a mental paradigm that was maybe accurate 30 or 40 years ago, but is not accurate today.
And for all the talk about gender-based crime, stuff like that, if you look at the statistics, and they'd have to be fudging them in a big way to be this far off, the number of things like rapes, for example, in a country like the UK, is something like 60-fold what it is in a country like Serbia. It was, and I'm trying to remember, but it was something insane like that. And so that's a topic that, rightfully so, gets a lot of attention in Western countries, and yet the Western countries are the ones that aren't doing well, and it's the countries that you would think are, that must be even worse, that are so much better.
Yeah, I think what happens is people selectively sweep things under the rug. They sort of don't count the downsides of this place, but they're very happy to point at the downsides of other places. And really, the lesson to me is it comes back to competition. That ultimately, if you're living somewhere and they're not, and the leaders, the rulers, the democracy is not doing a good job, you leave, and that will send a message in a way that you've got people leaving. Well, you're doing something wrong. You've got to fix it.
We all have our moment. One of the speakers here said, I stayed in Norway, kept trying to vote for the Libertarian Party, whatever it is. They never got more than 1% of the vote, and it almost kind of made them look smaller and make the ideas look smaller, like, they got 1%. It'd be almost better that they didn't run. What was your moment? That was his moment to say, you know what? I'm never going to vote my way to my country being what I want. I should just find what I want. What was your moment for that? Was it 2020?
Well, I would actually say Bitcoin, like stumbling across Bitcoin late 2012, early 2013. That was the moment that, now up until now, as I mentioned, I was libertarian, pretty much since 15 or 16, but I was a little bit hopeless in that sense, that I thought there's no real way to actualize this. But when I saw Bitcoin, I saw actually there's a real possibility to actually make the world freer. Now, of course, there's the financial freedom aspect, but I think more broader than that, it's actually restraining the size of the state. And I believe that currently today, they can do that because they have cheap debt fiat credit financing. In a Bitcoin world, it won't be so easy to do that. So I took a lot of hope in that, and that was something that to me was, okay, yes, we're not going to be able to get to liberty by voting for it, but we can actually enhance and push for liberty by adopting Bitcoin. And more people over time will do that. Now, yes, it's extremely volatile. I'll be the first to admit that. It's moved in these big waves, but each time we get new people coming into it, and each time is sort of closer and closer. Now, I see it's the only path to liberty, because if you're if the state can just print the money that we all work hard for, we are, in some sense, still their slaves. And if you can choose an alternate money that is scarce, that has all these qualities, right? You can verify it, you can do all these things. That was what appealed to me. Put it this way, if you had come to me in 2018 or 2019 and said, oh, Stephan, should you think about citizenships and residencies overseas? I might have thought like, okay, in theory, maybe, like, kind of, but it's just not.
When Bitcoin gets to $1 million, I'll do it.
Yeah, right? But then in 2020, it sort of was like, okay, it was definitely, I should have thought about that earlier. I think 2020 was the moment that I was locked into my home in Sydney, Australia, and I was thinking, my work is remote, it's online. Why don't I just leave instead of paying all these taxes to these people who don't care about me, don't care about the way I think, don't care about my freedoms? I might as well leave. And so that was essentially 2020. I was planning my escape. 2021, I left the prison island of Australia.
They don't care about you as relevant. I talked to a lot of entrepreneurs. Some of them are introverts, and they don't have a big network. They just have a very small number of people. And some of them are the most successful entrepreneurs they know. And so I don't think, and I've been in this position too, where they don't realize how unique they are, how unique their talents are, and how most people don't think as they do. And I think that's probably a bias that we suffer in a number of ways, whether it's being a libertarian, whether it's being an entrepreneur, whether it's being successful, that we lose sight in many cases of, particularly now and particularly in the West, a lot of people don't get what you're about. And I almost would ask you about that for Bitcoin too. If you're pro-Bitcoin, it would seem to me like putting people of like mind together is better than thinking, I'm going to sit around in Australia and they're never going to find me and tax my Bitcoin, because the culture is so much against what you stand for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so look, I see it as a decentralized freedom movement. Of course, I know Australian Bitcoiners out there, and but I think sadly, you're fighting this massive uphill battle when it's, as I'm sure you're aware, Harry Brown, Living Free in an Unfree World, right? Like, famous book. Obviously, it's this notion that just because the rest of the world doesn't really believe in freedom doesn't mean you can't. And you can't be, as Christian did a talk as well, this idea of the world is not free, but you can be. So I think it's really just taking on that message. But at the same time, looking, there are jurisdictions where obviously Bitcoin is supported, like El Salvador. Obviously, I would say the UAE is relatively, there's no capital gains tax. They're relatively, pro-Bitcoin. So I think it is about choosing the jurisdiction that suits you. And over time, I believe more and more places will flip to being pro-Bitcoin. Yes, there'll be a battle. Yes, there'll be some places that are anti-Bitcoin. But fundamentally, it's about, getting together with other people who think similarly to you. Now, I guess there's different strategies, to be clear, right? I know in America, there's the whole Free State Project as an idea, and so there's people trying to do that, and, good on them. I'm not an American, so obviously I have no, need to go and do that. I see it more like I can just sort of play I am fortunate that I am an Australian, so I have a relatively strong passport, and so I'm very lucky in that way. So obviously, I'm grateful for that, and I see it like people should just use the tools you have to find what works for you, because everyone's family situation is different as well. It's just such a, even though I live in Dubai, I'm not saying everyone has to go live in Dubai. It's more like you just have to find what works for yourself.
I would imagine in a country like Australia, like the aforementioned United States, they have something to lose, I would argue, from seeing something like Bitcoin proliferate. Whereas countries that want to get themselves on the map, that are looking to grow, that have a forward-thinking agenda, they have something to gain. What are your thoughts on that? And are there other countries that you see within the Bitcoin or other crypto communities that you think are flourishing?
Right. So, yeah, to touch on your point about something to lose versus something to gain, I think we are seeing central bank digital currency projects and pilots. So, for example, Australia recently did one, and they were basically trying to replicate some of the features of Bitcoin and some of these things like having smart contracting and various features that are used in the Lightning Network, in Bitcoin's Lightning Network. We don't get into the technicals, but they were trying to replicate at least the speed of transfers and certain smart contracting features. But they won't be able to replicate the idea of this digital scarcity. They won't. They just simply can't. Like, it's just not in their business model. So I think that is something that will become apparent over time, because obviously as more and more printing happens, governments around the world are in a lot of debt. they are just fundamentally going to have to either print a lot or they're going to have to default. And I think the answer is they're most likely going to print a lot, because that's the answer that is more politically tenable, because a lot of people have entitlements. People don't want those entitlements to go away. If the government can sort of make the CPI look lower, CPI, consumer price inflation, make that look lower while still having some printing going, they can kind of inflate away the real purchasing power of the debt that they have. So I think that's kind of the financial repression angle that they're going to do. So in terms of bringing it to the second part of your question, what countries do I see that are positive with Bitcoin? I think, yeah, so as I mentioned, UAE, El Salvador. I think we're seeing a lot of adoption of Bitcoin in all kinds of places, like even Nigeria, places like Vietnam, Turkey. Obviously, also you like Turkey as well.
For some things, sure. I mean, there's elements, right?
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah. Not to say you wholeheartedly endorse everything about the country, but yeah, certainly I think we will see more and more people in some of those other countries because they see the need more. And so here's the other thing. It's funny that as Bitcoin is down from the high of 69,000 to today, whatever, it's 25, 26,000, but it's funny that it's hitting all-time highs in other, denominated in other currencies. So I think in Turkey, it's sort of recently, in terms of Turkish lira, it recently hit an all-time high.
The lira has not done very well at all.
Yeah.
But you know what? I will give a country like Turkey, and you could say this about many countries. Obviously, we talk about Turkey because they have a citizenship program, which it's a way to, maybe not if you're in Bitcoin and you have an opportunity cost, but if you have cash in the bank, buy property, get citizenship, sell the property later. But I'll give people in a country like that this. They never trusted their government as much as the Australians or the Americans did.
And I think this comes back to the complacency point we were talking about, because some of these people from, let's say, post-Soviet nations or other nations where they were more skeptical because they had to be. And so it was more natural for them to sort of view government programs with a little bit of a skeptical eye, whereas the typical person in Australia or America or the UK, they tend to just trust their government. Now, probably in the last few years, we've seen that trust level come down a little bit. So we'll see what happens as that trust level comes down a little bit more. Maybe more of those people start to explore Bitcoin, they explore nomad capitalist sort of ideas.
These people are trusting their government less. Let's talk about optimism. If you look at some statistics of how proud are you to be an American, it's been going down for about the last quarter of a century. Talk about Australia. Compare the level of optimism, the level of people that you would find as someone who's open-minded in Australia, and contrast that with what you're seeing in Dubai, where you've moved.
I think it's funny. I talk with some of my Australian friends. Some of them they're sort of laughing at how bad things are getting. Like that, every woke cause of the day that just gets accepted. So, for example, they're trying to ban gas cookers in Victoria and New South Wales, as an example. So you can't have a gas cooker and stuff on a new build. And it's just like all these crazy new regulations. It's just new regulation, new regulation, new regulation, with little concern for the individuals and the people whose lives are impacted by these things. Exactly. And maybe if you're an Asian...
But they're business friendly, everyone thinks. Even the libertarian think tanks. Yeah. Australia is no longer totally free. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But they're now in the mostly free category, I think. But they're still high ranking. And yet, so many regulations, such high taxes. What is it that makes it so free? But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. They have been dropping a lot. And I think, it's funny, growing up, I used to point to that and say, oh, look, talk to people saying, look, Australia is actually one of the more free countries. Okay, yes, despite some high taxes at the higher end. Yeah, I think just bringing it back to the optimism I think people have, I think certainly in the UAE, I get more of a sense of I think they are just more optimistic. Obviously, it depends who you're talking to and what circles you run in. But for example, the property market there has been going up a lot. Now, of course, that can mean cost of living can rise too. Rents have been up maybe 30 or 40%. It's not crazy to see 30 or 40% rent rises in the last year for Dubai, because I think they were coming from a lower place, and so with all the things that have happened, like Russians or maybe Chinese people or other people moving to the UAE, so I think that's caused that. But at the same time, I think we are seeing more optimism there as well, and people who are just overall getting good quality of life there. So I think it is about not focusing too much on kind of the negative, but also about building on something positive and building towards a vision. Because I think it's one thing to sort of sit and criticize what's happening in the Western countries or whatever, but it's also about showing people a vision of what you think the world could be. and how I see the world becoming if we were to move towards a Bitcoin standard and having these things like lower taxes and less regulation and all these things that, you know, libertarian people like. I think it's about selling a vision of what would the future look like. And it's also about trying to set an example and say, well, we have to lead by example, and then other people can follow if they like what we're doing.
Talk about my concept of soft freedom. We've discussed this a little bit where, sure, Western countries, things may be documented a bit more, and yet you come to a place like a Malaysia where we are now, perhaps Dubai falls into this, and just in terms of every day walking around, I'll tell you, I feel more free. I feel more unbothered by the government. What are your observations on this concept of soft freedom?
Yeah, I think I definitely have seen similar to you in that I have, as an example, even looking back a few years, I remember looking at during the during the COVID hysteria era, there was all these rules about, okay, this and that, and which country you're going to, and there were some countries where they would have a huge stack of rules, but then actually when you go there and show the passport and they just kind of look at it and stamp you through, I found UAE wasn't like that. It's sort of like there was all these rules, but you could pretty much just show up with the passport, and now maybe that's because I have an Australian passport, maybe that was...
They treat you pretty well there?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've had a great experience overall, like in terms of, you know, there's always some level of bureaucracy, right? There's no, you know, perfect place, but ultimately I think they were quite efficient at kind of processing things. For me, for my wife, I had my son was born in the UAE. So it was actually relatively good. There were some times where we got a little bit of runaround, but once you sort of figured out how to get things done, and there were services where they sort of, it's called document clearing, and they can go and run around and get the signatures and get whatever you need. So that element I think you can deal with there, and I'm sure similar services exist elsewhere. But you know, bringing it back to this hard freedom versus soft freedom idea, I think it really does matter around just sort of attitudes of the people you talk to and you discuss with, and even the other aspect in the UAE, as we mentioned, is it's 90% expat. So you're kind of, the culture of the people you're talking to, they're from other countries as well. So maybe that's an interesting, it creates an interesting environment. I
hope, as I said here at the event, I hope they go from calling themselves expats to calling themselves nomad capitalists and adding a certain level of permanence to living there. Because the idea for me of we're going to go for 3 years and then we're going to go back home, quote unquote, I think people should shift to maybe this is where you want to live, in the same way that we all had ancestors that came from somewhere else. You did, I did.
Totally with you there.
You know, we all look up to them. Well, they were courageous. They did the right thing. Oh, that was the only thing they could have done. It was totally falling apart where they came from.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. I think it's interesting to point out that at the age my parents left Sri Lanka to go to Australia, that was 30 years ago. My dad was 33. And I was basically that same age when I left Australia to go to Dubai. So it was funny that it worked out that way. But certainly that aspect of, I think to your point about not just going overseas and seeing it like, oh, this is just a 2-year stint or a 3-year stint and then we're going back to Australia. No, that's not it for me. It's literally Dubai is my new home base. And I may look at other places, whether I want to have like a secondary or some other place in the future, maybe Malaysia, maybe Thailand, I don't know. So I had my son there in the UAE, and UAE is our base for now, and I'm not planning to go back to Australia. That's my plan.
Certainly, you have a lot more ability if you want to keep that in your back pocket than somebody 200 years ago. And I hope, though, if you plan to have more children, we can help you give birth somewhere. And
that was something I thought about.
We've been talking about it here.
For logistical reasons, of course, I know, was it Mexico, Brazil, potentially Argentina are sort of...
Much of Latin America, yeah.
Yeah, I thought of those options, but I think just logistically it would have been difficult for us. I seriously did consider that, and my wife was actually open to it. Maybe for a future child, we'll see.
That'll have to be for the future. Stephan Livera, they can find it at stephanlivera.com, and it's great to have you here in Kuala Lumpur.
Thank you, Andrew.
My pleasure.